We are joined today by Ryan Phillips of the Tuscaloosa Patch. You can find him on Twitter, Ryan Phillips, also on Patch at tuscaloosa.patch.com. He's had a ton of reporting about this Darius Miles case. As I said up at the top of this show, I'm not trying to take this lightly. I know this is much larger than sports. A young lady did lose her life, but I bring him on to kind of talk about the facts of this case because he's seen the video footage. He's been in court through all the proceedings over the past multiple years. So how you doing today, Ryan?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the case. It was a really long week last week. I think that was probably the longest murder trial I've covered in over the dozen or so that I've covered from start to finish. So, I mean, there is a lot to unpack. I know that the verdict came as a shock to some, probably justice to others. So, like I said, there really is a lot to unpack with it. So, like I said, I'm here, to answer any questions you got. And also, if any readers are out there that have questions, my email is ryan.phillips@patch.com. Feel free to reach out. Like I said, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, of course. And as I said, this is more of a discussion. I want to be able to get, what the facts of the case were. You were one of the first people to see the video, some of the video evidence, even ahead of, this trial. I know you were able to see what you had originally described and went through in depth over at Patch. And if y'all have not read any of his coverage, please check it out. It's been absolutely incredible. But I want to kind of start at the top over, let's give a brief overview of set the scene. Obviously, I know that it was the basketball players and everyone are celebrating, and the people on the strip are celebrating the Alabama LSU game. It's late in the morning. There's people leaving the club, some coming to the clubs. What's the scene of what is Tuscaloosa like that night?
Yeah, I mean, it was packed. I think that the best comparison I could give it to locals would be, A-Day. The strip was just really inundated with folks. It was an afternoon game with LSU that day. So it was a lot of nighttime left after that game for folks to go out. I stayed in. I'm a townie, so like I really try to avoid, the strip or downtown after anything big like that. But I remember, getting calls around 2:00 in the morning, which was when the shooting happened. And there were murmurs that the first any basketball player ever came into it was that there were murmurs that Brandon Miller was involved. I didn't really believe that. I just thought it was, just rumors from off the street. But we did find out like a woman had gotten shot and killed near the strip. I don't want to sound callous with this, but I mean, the violent crime rate in Tuscaloosa has gone up exponentially since I was a kid. So I mean, we really do have more of these incidents than I think anybody would like to admit. It's not to downplay the severity of it or, the victim's memory or anything, but it's really easy for me, for a lot of other people in the media, that we have a murder, they get the arrest, and we move on to the next one. I think that's just the nature of doing local news, right? But I knew that this one was bigger because a woman had gotten killed. Again, not to like be any sort of way about that, but that just doesn't happen often. So, the Violent Crimes Unit had told us that Sunday afternoon after the shooting, that they're going to have a press conference. Didn't tell us what was going on, and I think this was where all the whirlwind of rumor and innuendo and all that just like started to swirl, was with the lack of, I don't want to say transparency, because it's not the cops' job to be transparent with us. It's our job to figure it out. But it was such a complex thing that I don't know. In hindsight, maybe a little bit more information up front would have helped. But anyways, that we find out they're going to do this press conference, and we get out there, and I'll never forget the commander of the homicide unit, which my dad actually was the commander of that homicide unit several years ago. So like I grew up, knew most of these guys like before. So, that it didn't really seem anything out of the ordinary. And I'll never forget, he had his press conference and was reading the names. He was like, told us what had happened, that a woman had gotten killed in a shooting overnight near the strip. And when he read off the names, he said, Michael Lynn Davis of Charles County, Maryland, and then Darius Miles of Maryland or whatever. And I just remember like looking around at the other reporters. Like, I mean, I'm a big Crimson Tide sports fan, like across the board. I grew up here, went to school here. But I remember like looking around at the other reporters, like, Darius Miles, a basketball player? Like, that kind of, started setting off alarm bells. But so it turns out that's who it was. I'll never forget, like, standing there. I still have the video of it. of them walking them out of violent crimes, and Darius is boohooing. Like, I mean, it was as far as perp walks go, it was way on up there in terms of one you don't forget. And we rock on a couple months, and by then the rumor mill had swirled so bad that it had been everything from that Brandon Miller had shot and killed somebody to Darius had killed Jamia because she turned down his sexual advances. I mean, just all sorts of stuff that really wasn't anything close to the truth. And I mean, I was fascinated from the beginning as to what had happened, because it just seemed like, again, Division I basketball player, whole life ahead of him. Like, it doesn't really seem like they just got mad and started shooting at each other, right? Which in reality, like, now that we've seen all the evidence, kind of seems like that was the case. So I don't know, but then actually getting to like break that story and kind of set the narrative straight, because I think that's where a lot of people get confused. Is I'm not trying to absolve anybody. I'm just trying to do my job as a journalist, and actually get the facts of the story out in the right context. Because again, if this had been a standard, violent crimes unit announcement or whatever, the name Cedric Johnson probably would have never come up. Like, the involvement of another party in that shooting would have never come up. I mean, we have shootings every not every day, but like often enough. Like, normally you just hear about the side who got arrested, right? So there were a lot of complexities with that, and then rock on 2 years later, and we just had our first trials. So I think that's where a lot of people are more up to speed on that. That Michael Lynn Davis, the guy who's accused of firing the gun that Darius provided that ended up killing Jamia Harris, he went on trial. It lasted about 3 days with testimony, not including jury selection. And the jury found him guilty of capital murder with about an hour of deliberation. So now the next thing we have is Darius's trial that's coming up, and I've been told that we probably won't get any word on that till early July. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Gotcha. Yeah, and thanks for setting the scene. And we'll cover the Darius piece and how it relates to him toward the end. I wanted to also, you were talking about some of the different things, and I, for those of you that may have not already read Ryan's pieces, he has a couple of super in-depth pieces, and what I appreciate is you didn't worry that, hey, this is going to go over some artificial word count. Like, if it took 4,000 words to write it, it took 4,000 words to write it, right? This is the facts of the case as hour by hour when you went through the video. And similarly, when you were talking to the jurors, right, you spoke to some of the jurors after the Michael Davis verdict, and a couple of the things that kind of stood out to me, one of the ones, and it's kind of the key piece of evidence, or the key piece that the defense tried to use, was that they thought that this was, people stalking in the night, people hunting, a gang hit, a drug hit, some type of hit, because the lights were turned off. There was a lot of discussion around, him reaching for the flashers was not near where the headlights were, etc. And one of the jurors even said, was this a gang hit? Probably, but that doesn't defend the fact that he fired on Jamia. That was the part that I think kind of stood out to me is, and this, if we take a step back as from you being a journalist, like, do you think that you can, or even as a journalist, right, you look at all these cases, like, is there the differentiation that, hey, this one of these is a, like, hey, this is our reason for defense? Like, obviously a jury found him guilty, and so that's what he is at this point. But, like, I thought that one really stood out to me when I read what that juror said of, like, hey, we don't care that this probably was something else. Like, she wasn't involved in that, if that makes sense.
And the way that I've explained that to folks, and it really did, it made good sense to me, that the way I feel like this jury approached it, which again, every jury's different, there's going to be a completely different group of 14 people, 12 jurors, 2 alternates for Darius's trial. So to judge how his trial will go based on this would be a farce. Like, you can't really do that. But with this jury, I think what was so interesting is that they applied the law to the act that happened instead of interpreting all of these exterior circumstances that we had with the shooting, the potential drive-by, the seeing the gun in the car, that when I first really, probably about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, right when I started digging around on this, I talked to a lot of Second Amendment attorneys, like, pro gun type attorneys, who were big on, like, the whole stand your ground defense, things like that. And this, I guess I just use this as an example to show how we can get tunnel vision on the outside and looking at something, and that might not necessarily be how a jury interprets it. That, from the way that they described it, and these are people from the, different kind of political views, but just very pro gun regardless. That it's all about the first person who felt threatened, right? And the argument was up until trial that the basketball player group with Darius, Jaden Bradley, and Michael Davis, that they felt threatened first when they saw the gun. So that prompted them to take defensive measures, right? But I think what was so interesting is that since like what that one juror said that I talked to, that he says just two groups of bad dudes, like, hunting each other. And I thought that was an interesting look, because I've been so embedded with this story that it's so much more nuanced in my view. And that's not necessarily, I don't think, how the law should be interpreted. Like, that's just me telling the story, right? And when he made the whole comment about it all boiling down to the 10 seconds where Michael could be seen running from behind the building, behind the Jeep, and then pulling the trigger, I thought that was interesting in the sense that all of this other stuff that we've talked about, all of the witnesses that have died. We've had two witnesses die in this case that would have been key witnesses. Stuff like that. All of that stuff really didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Like, to the jury, that it really boiled down to Michael's decision to hide behind the building with a gun and then run beside the Jeep and start shooting. Even though Cedric shot him twice, from the driver's seat, didn't matter to them.
And I almost wonder if, and this is a ifs and buts or candy and nuts kind of situation. It doesn't matter what you say, but I wonder if the jury interpreted this because the person that died in this isn't the person that had the gun, right? Like, does the jury interpret this differently if Cedric Johnson's the one that dies instead of Jamea Harris, right? Like, because he enacted his self-defense towards the person that had the gun, right? Like, and this is, again, purely speculation on my part, but that may have changed some of the thought process because, their interpretation of that is, hey, like, even if you did see a gun passed, or even if this did take place, the lady who lost her life was not the person who had the gun in her possession, right? Whether she touched it or not's a moot point at that point, right?
And so much of I think what the jury responded to was, like the juror said in that story, it was who they viewed as attacking first. And it is, if you're just watching the 10 seconds that they're talking about, Michael definitely does look the aggressor. I mean, he's the one who runs up to the Jeep. And sometimes, like, the simplest explanations are the best in these kind of cases. That, I think the juror raised the point that, if he was really so afraid for his life, why didn't he just keep hiding? Why did he run up? Or the argument that if he had really seen, and this stood out to me, that he was like, that if you had really seen a gun, his words, not mine, but if you had really seen a gun, you would have had somebody to physically pull you away. I thought that was interesting because I mean, that's something that, if I'm trying to put myself, on the street that night, if I'm arguing with somebody and I see them pull out a gun and I'm not armed, no, I'm getting out. But I don't know. It's again, he made another good point that was, do you really think what they said in court, what Cedric testified, and then what Michael later testified on the witness stand about what they had said to each other in that initial exchange on the strip that sparked all this? He's like, you really think it was, I don't want your girl, and like, no, we're good. He's like, no, I bet they threatened to kill each other for 30 seconds or however long that exchange was, and then we're both mad as hell once it was over.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the situation when you're talking about this is there is some hearsay. There's also evidence that the jurors are only, when you looked at some of the evidence originally, and you also, again, like you said, some of the, people involved in this case, with Darius and Jaden Bradley, and then later on Brandon Miller, being involved in this case and getting to the witness stand. The fact that it feels like and this is for good reason, right? But the jury is only able to see certain pieces of evidence, right? The judge only allows certain pieces of evidence. So, for example, in this case, something that you reported on was the fact that the amount of weed and stuff that was in the Jeep that was unable to be, given to the jury, so to speak. They couldn't be shown that, couldn't take that into consideration. I think that that's something else that we have to consider is, as outsiders, right? We're not on the jury. We're hearing what the reporters are telling us. We get all the facts, right? And any of us that have read multiple articles, whether it's yours or others, we get whatever those jurors or whatever those reporters are telling us, right? But as a juror, they have to deal with, these are the facts that we've been presented in court. Right. And those are not always the same, right? In some cases, it may be some of the same, but in some cases, it's not. Do you think that, some of the things that were withheld from these jurors, whether it be the marijuana, or do you think that because of the stance they took, and this goes back to kind of what you just said a second ago, the stance that they took of, hey, it was the aggressor in that very moment. We don't care if it's a drug deal gone bad. It wouldn't have even mattered if that had been brought up because the stance they were taking was the stance they were taking.
Right. And no, I mean that the one juror told me that, and now granted the other, I didn't talk to the rest of the jury, but he said that the marijuana in the backpack that was found in the Jeep wouldn't have made a big deal to him. Yeah, but another thing in that respect too was the wrongful death civil suit that Cedric Johnson was a defendant along with Brandon Miller, Darius, and Michael Davis. And then was removed from the civil suit before it was settled. I think that I reported on that. A lot of other people did too, but Judge Pruitt, who did a great job in this case, I think he was really down the middle, real pragmatic with everything that he had to do. He explained this is just kind of a sidebar for all this, but about the wrongful death lawsuit, that he's like, after having practiced in civil cases before he became an elected judge, that he was like, there are so many reasons, none of which may be relevant to this trial, why he was removed from the wrongful death lawsuit. It could have been the jurisdiction that it was in. I mean, just all of these reasons that really have nothing to do with right or wrong. It's just more of a procedural thing or something like that. So I think that might have even been lost on me and other reporters too, because I mean, none of us have practiced civil law. So, how would we know the nuances of that? But with the backpack, that's one thing that I feel like might have worked against the defense for Michael Davis. Because I mean, after I watched the jury, I saw their faces throughout. They really didn't respond well to John Robbins, his defense attorney. And not to say that John didn't do everything he could for him, but it's just, like I've told everybody, in a murder trial or in any jury trial for that matter, it's two sides trying to convince 12 people that their story is the right one, right? And I really didn't think at any point that Davis's attorney had the high ground in this trial. I think it could be completely different for Darius. I think that there are some different possibilities that he could distance himself, especially after Buzz went down for this. So I don't know. There's so many complexities with it, but the piece of evidence for me that if the jury really responded to that 10 seconds, I think the evidence that I responded most to in court was the violent crimes unit interrogation of Michael. I thought it was really telling, where he is not wanting to cooperate. He's not, he says he doesn't know how he got shot, doesn't know where he was when he got shot, doesn't know who did it, nor does he particularly care to find out who did it, and this is like the whole time Cedric's already cooperated with the police at this point, and the investigator even mentions to him, he's like, I've already talked to Darius and your friends. I know where you were when you got shot. I know how you got shot. I know who shot you. Why don't you tell me what happened? And he didn't. And then they make the fatal mistake at trial of putting him on the stand, and he basically everything he says up there refutes everything he had already told an investigator. So his credibility is already brought into question with that. And then, just the fact that he couldn't keep his story straight. I think, the jury responded to that. I responded to that. Like, seeing the video, I think that there's really nowhere to hide. And I don't think that they had any other choice but to put him on the stand, hoping that, just by some miracle, he could convince the jury not to convict him.
And I had heard, I don't know if there's any truth to this, that he also was told he kind of had to see the stand if he wanted to go for the self-defense side of the argument, where the judge may have even required that. I don't know if that was the case, or that they were told, hey, this is, if you want to go for this defense, right, you really need to put him on the stand, and so that he can kind of attest to why he's giving that defense. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay. So at this point, I think I kind of want to move over to Darius, because you mentioned something where, Darius had already, been spoken to by the violent crimes unit and other things. And I think that when you're looking at Darius's involvement in this, that's when we obviously bring in Brandon Miller and all the, pundits that have spoken at length about whether he should or should not have been convicted. The simple fact of the matter is the Tuscaloosa Violent Crimes Unit and the DA's office looked at the evidence of the case, looked at Brandon's dash cam, both forward and rear facing, and decided that he was not involved. They assume, or they see that he was on the way to pick them up at the time of the texts that are being sent that kind of bring Brandon into this. So I think when we're talking about Darius Miles, I guess my first question is, you're talking about the difference in them being able to move themselves. Would you look at this as because Michael Davis has been convicted, it's going to be an uphill battle for Darius, or do you think that these are going to be seen as two truly separate endeavors entirely, so to speak?
Well, the two cases are inextricably linked. Like there's no way around that. I think the strategy, if I'm just calling balls and strikes here, I think the strategy for Darius's case was pretty smart to distance himself from that because he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. I think that, and I'm just going to address the obvious thing that came out in court the other day, that when Michael was testifying, and I think this is going to be something that comes up in the next trial, and something that Darius's defense attorneys will have to really fight to try to prove, that he made the comment completely unsolicited comment on the stand that right after the shooting, he gave the gun back to Darius. So now we're talking about a chain of custody with the gun. So now the next person who has it, at least, I mean, depending on how credible you think this witness is, now the gun is in Darius's hands right after the shooting. And what happened, it wasn't turned over to the police. It was recovered wrapped in a Gatorade towel after a search warrant of Jaden Quinterly's apartment. I think that if I'm a prosecutor, I think that's plenty to convince a jury with, if you can prove it. But I also think for Darius's case, I think that's going to be tough. And again, that's just the fact that Michael went on the stand and volunteered that information, I think was pretty stunning. But again, I think the defense for Darius will be able to make the argument that he's not a credible witness at all. He's not a credible anything, considering how much he's already been caught lying to the police. So those are definitely things to watch for, like when we get to Darius's trial.
Yeah, and I didn't know that was fully unsolicited. I had read that and saw that in some of your articles you had written that it was found in Jaden's apartment, and that he had said that Darius is the one to do it. I thought he was asked about that, so that's definitely
telling. If I remember right, and again, we weren't allowed recorders in there. I'd have to dig through my notebook, but it was one of those moments where I feel like he was explaining something else, or like what had happened right after he had gotten to the apartment after the shooting, and then like mentioned that like in passing. I could be wrong. Like I said, we didn't have our recording equipment in there, but it was, of all of his testimony, that was one of the things that he said that was like, whoa, this could really spill over into, his co-defendant's case.
Sure. Yeah. And so I guess the question then becomes, obviously we're not going to know how the jury is going to take that evidence. Are they going to see Michael Davis as credible, or are they going to be as the jury that, convicted Michael Davis and see him as not credible at all, and potentially, that obviously he did this crime, because now at this point he's guilty of the crime. But the question kind of becomes on the Darius side. I think that obviously that is the after the shooting. But I think, when you're talking about what Darius is potentially being charged with and what he's going to be, on trial for, is also providing it, right? So it's the before, not just the after.
Right.
And so I think that also is going to come into question of, it was a legally owned firearm. However, even if you have a legally owned firearm, if you are presenting it to somebody in which what they're going to do with it, that makes it illegal, right?
And see, I think what'll be the main argument for Darius's attorneys will be that he really did feel threatened and really did give Buzz the gun, thinking that, okay, we are in danger here. That how could Darius have known that Buzz was going to hide behind a building and then run up to the Jeep? Not because, like one of the jurors said, and I thought this was another good point, that he was like, had we had video of them, the Jeep just pulls up and they're both flat-footed on the sidewalk looking at each other and start shooting, he's like, I'm not sure we would be able to come to a verdict. But then you see him run up to the Jeep, and it's like, well, that tells us who was attacking, So it's all about how much can you prove that Darius knew that was going to happen. Honestly, I don't think there's much to that. I think that the district attorney's office, the jury also kind of listened to this. The whole idea of him flipping his hood up as he walked by, but we see that multiple times throughout the night. So, I think that that'll be something that his defense attorneys will argue, be like, that, well, if he was given a signal, why didn't he do it? I mean, why wasn't somebody else shot every other time he did it? That we have on video throughout the night. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Sure, yeah, it does. And I think the other piece of evidence that I'd like for you to go into, because I thought it was another piece that I really was curious about, and from the district attorney's office, it was the spot that I think is one of the more credible ones of, there's discussion about Darius, getting the girls away from the scene. And it was something that kind of related to me that, I would want if I thought something was going to go down, I might want to get the people that I care the most about away from the shenanigans that's about to go on. Do you look at that as something that Darius's case or side is going to have to, fight against, or do you think that could be kind of easily displayed off? Again, I haven't seen the video, but you have, so I'm just curious.
Well, and again, this goes back to like all of this massive external evidence, I guess is like the best way to call it, circumstantial evidence, that's around this case, because what the defense is going to argue, almost certainly, I can damn near guarantee you that they're going to argue that Darius is wanting to get his girlfriend Skylar out of there because she had just been involved in a fight, like that was caught on camera, like right there. They had already had a bunch of drama, that they're scared of this Jeep. And again, this is what I think the defense will argue, not necessarily, what I think. But that again, there was just so much going on. It was like all this chaos, especially with that big fight with all the girls that they saw on camera. But then what the DA's office will probably argue is that he is on video and, with testimony saying like, get them out of here, so that is a thing. But it just all depends on how you look at that evidence, and then how each side distills it down to the jury, because I think there's a lot to be said about the fight that had occurred there. I think that was what made them end up on Gray Street, just from the way that the progression of that 7 minutes looks from the second they leave 12:25 to when the shooting happens. Like it really does look like they were put on that. And now, granted, like Jaden Bradley had parked over there, so there's another reason why they're in that area. There are plenty of reasons I think the defense could argue that that they weren't stalking the folks in the Jeep, and plenty of arguments again that the jury saw in Michael's trial that it was obvious they were up to something. Like, but it's all about who attacks who.
Sure. Absolutely. So I think that's really the evidence that we really had to talk about. Of course, people are going to bring up the fact that Jaden Bradley and Brandon Miller both testified in this case. And there's going to be people that say, hey, that these people should have been tried and convicted. But I want to reiterate one last time, the DA's office and everyone involved in this case has obviously seen the footage, whether it be from the many surveillance cameras as well as the dash cam footage of these cars, and finds them not at fault in any way in this. So I just want to reiterate that, kind of here at the top. Lastly, I just want to give you the floor to kind of talk about anything. If you think there's any last thing that you would like for the audience to know about this case, obviously we will anxiously await what happens with Darius Miles' trial. I can have you on to talk about that, after that happens in July or whatever time frame that kind of rolls around to. But is there anything else that you think, pertinent for people to know?
I mean, it's a slog with these things. I'm surprised. We have another capital murder trial going on right now that was, a police officer who got murdered. And it's been going. We haven't gone to trial in 5 years on that. So I do think that we're a bit. I don't want to say fortunate because it's just a tragedy all the way around. But Michael was able to get a trial, and within 2 years, I think we should be happy that Darius is probably going to see one in the next few months. But it's going to be one of those things that regardless of what side you're on, I would really caution against using the outcome of Michael's trial to predict how Darius is going to go. There could be more evidence come out between now and then. There could be all sorts of different shifts, a different jury, obviously. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those, that's the only thing that I would say to caution against, looking through the lens of this trial to look towards the next one.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you let everybody know that. I really appreciate you coming on the show. As always, I said up at the top, he's Ryan Phillips. You can find him at tuscaloosa.patch.com. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Ryan. I appreciate all the help.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me.
Of course. You have a great rest of your day.
You too.